We choose our diets, we curate our sleep schedules, and we manage our workflows. We feel entirely free, yet we spend every waking hour optimizing ourselves into better machines. Welcome to the totally administered world. It is a society where every human action, from how we rest to how we socialize, is engineered, measured, and extracted for maximum productivity. To understand how we arrived here, we have to look back to the 1930s. A group of philosophers asked a radical question: why do modern populations consistently embrace economic and political systems that actively dismantle their own freedom? That question formed the core research agenda at the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt, Germany. The scholars there examined the dominant scientific and economic models of their time. They classified these as traditional theory, frameworks that accept the current capitalist order as a permanent, natural law of human existence. In response, they developed critical theory. This framework interrogates the very genesis of social rules, exposing the power structures that benefit from treating those rules as unchangeable. The engine driving this analysis is a method known as immanent critique. Immanent critique doesn't judge a culture from an external, utopian moral high ground. Instead, it holds a mirror up to a society and uses that society's own stated ideals to highlight its internal contradictions. When applied to modern Western society, the critique reveals a stark reality. The Enlightenment promised rational liberation, but the actual outcome is a highly sophisticated mass conformity. The hyper-optimized, constantly hustling modern individual is not an independent agent. This version of the human subject is a deliberate artifact, manufactured by late-stage capitalism to serve its own need for endless economic growth. True freedom is impossible until we recognize that the autonomy we experience every day is a carefully constructed illusion. The philosopher Herbert Marcuse diagnosed this exact condition in his 1964 book, One-Dimensional Man. He argued that modern subjects have entirely internalized the system's mechanisms of control. In a healthy society, there is a natural friction between a person's raw, authentic desires and the harsh demands of the economy. The one-dimensional state successfully flattens that friction, making the economy's goals feel indistinguishable from our own. This provides the critical definition of ideology. Rather than conscious propaganda or simple political talking points, it functions as a structural, lived reality that aligns your personal identity with corporate profit. The tragic result is that we willingly engineer our own subjugation. We track our sleep cycles, monetize our hobbies, and experience extreme self-exploitation as a form of personal growth. Systemic domination becomes absolute when the subject can no longer even imagine a version of themselves or a version of the world outside the metrics of productivity. The theoretical foundation for this total control was laid out in 1947 in a text called Dialectic of Enlightenment. It serves as a grim autopsy of human progress. Co-authored by Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, the book delivers a severe warning. The rationality of the Enlightenment, originally meant to free humanity from fear and myth, has self-destructed. Human reason mutated into a mechanism they called instrumental reason. Instrumental reason strips away ethical purpose and human flourishing. It reduces critical thought to a cold binary calculation. What is the most efficient means to a given end? The output immediately becomes the input for the next, creating an inescapable, accelerating loop. Earlier forms of 20th century authoritarianism relied on overt, coercive discipline. They operated under the mandate of "you should." Late capitalist domination is far more subtle. It operates through the relentless, toxic positivity of "you can." The concept of limitless human potential is weaponized. If you can always be better, faster, and more efficient, then you are permanently obligated to try. This mandate of potential masks what critical theorists call surplus repression, the extra psychological constraints placed on individuals solely to maintain the current economic order. The result is a distinct, modern psychological state, an agonizing, low-grade anxiety that you are never quite optimized, productive, or valuable enough. The contemporary demand to unlock your infinite potential is actually an insidious disciplinary mechanism designed to eliminate any mode of existence that isn't profitable. The daily lived experience of this endless optimization is captured by a concept rooted in the work of Karl Marx and Georg Lukács, reification. Reification is a psychological tragedy. It occurs when a human subject treats their own time, their own mind, and their relationships with others as quantifiable, thing-like commodities to be managed and traded. To explain how this commodity logic spreads into our private lives, the philosopher Jürgen Habermas diagnosed a process he called the colonization of the life world. Habermas divides society into two zones. The life world is the organic sphere where we share culture and meaning. The system is the rigid domain of bureaucracy and markets. Colonization happens when the system aggressively expands, forcing the life world to operate by rules of efficiency. Once colonized, private spheres like sleep, diet, and rest are no longer treated as intrinsic goods. They are annexed as vital resources required to maintain the machinery of human capital. Under total reification, the human being is liquidated entirely into a set of performance metrics, violently erasing the boundary between life and labor. Eventually, the math stops working. The reified subject reaches a breaking point, resulting in biological and psychological collapse under the weight of infinite self-exploitation. The core mandate of the Frankfurt School is that critical theory must enter itself in the observation of exactly these kinds of societal contradictions and crises. Late capitalism has developed a highly effective, deeply paradoxical defense mechanism to protect itself when its workers begin to collapse. The system survives by aggressively recoding massive, structural macroeconomic failures as individual, biological pathologies. If a worker is suffering from severe exhaustion, the framework of the administered world strictly forbids any structural or economic critique of their working conditions. Instead of offering structural relief, the system immediately prescribes highly localized chemical and medical interventions. These interventions target the biological hardware. They aim to reboot the worker back to baseline productivity so they can return to the exact environment that caused the collapse. This medicalization effectively severs the intellectual link between a person's individual suffering and the systemic flaws of the economy. By treating systemic burnout as a person deficit, the system isolates the worker and neutralizes collective anger. It suppresses what the contemporary critical theorist Rahel Yegi calls experimental learning processes, the ability of a community to recognize a shared problem and collectively adapt. This enforced isolation actively prevents the formation of class consciousness. If you believe your exhaustion is just a chemical imbalance, you don't organize a union, you adjust your dosage. By medicalizing its own capitalist contradictions, the system effectively inoculates itself against any possibility of organized resistance or revolution. Compare this modern, isolated, and medicated subject with the historical reality of collective social struggles, where marginalized groups actively joined forces to demand structural change. To reclaim that power, we have to revisit Adorno's concept of the non-identical. It is the vital necessity of embracing the useless, the aesthetic, and the messy parts of human experience that completely refuse to be quantified. Authentic critical theory and authentic art must act as a refuge for these unquantifiable traits. They have to preserve a utopian promise of happiness that is entirely distinct from our current administered reality. If we remain trapped within the ideology of instrumental reason, if we keep filtering every human impulse through the lens of efficiency, we permanently foreclose the possibility of true emancipation. The final victory of the administered world is a psychological one. Its subjects mistake the agonizing exhaustion of their own exploitation for the pinnacle of human freedom.